Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today I'm joined by Erfan. Erfan is a scientist doing research for his master's degree in exercise physiology and recently authored a very interesting study on how someone's training status, whether they are kind of more or less trained, influences kind of the benefits that they get from caffeine. So thanks for coming on here today, Erfan.
Thank you for having me, Ryan.
You bet. Cool. So, kind of diving into your recent study here, I think it would be helpful for the audience to just get a little bit of a background on why you kind of wanted to do this study and what kind of led you to doing this study.
Actually, I'm afraid to say that I'm a caffeine addict, and from that, I love to study. I started to study caffeine in my period of studying during master thesis, and the topic I studied is the recent paper is the effectiveness of caffeine in resistance race exercise and the relationship between training status. And why I did this study could be somewhat related to my master thesis that I investigated the effectiveness of congestion of caffeine and beetroot juice supplementation on semi-professional soccer athletes in the specific endurance test that I saw training status might diminish the ergogenic effects of supplements. So, and further I read, I found training status affects some nutritional intervention, for example, carbohydrate periodization or beetroot juice supplementation might not have ergogenic benefits for highly trained athletes, highly endurance trained athletes, or athletes with high cardiovascular fitness. But regarding the caffeine and resistance exercise, actually there wasn't clear whether training status or your fitness level could diminish ergogenic effects of caffeine or not. So I decided to examine whether caffeine's effects on resistant exercise and jumping performance are moderated by training status or no.
Gotcha. So, basically, you saw some other evidence that pointed to training status might affect how these different supplements work. So you wanted to see how training status is, if that's affected by caffeine intake. And just for the audience, you kind of mentioned ergogenic benefits a little bit. My understanding is what that means is that it improves performance, whether that is through your resistance training or jump performance or something like that. Is that a decent understanding of what ergogenic means there?
Yeah, good question, Ryan. Ergogenic benefits is somewhat meaning that in performance improvement in various type of exercise, we use these words actually in scientific literature. For example, in regarding caffeine ergogenic benefits in resistant exercise, it's scientific literature reported caffeine could improve the 1RM muscle strength and muscular endurance, and as well as mean repetition velocity, the velocity you up and down the
Hmm.
halter, for example.
Yep.
And in endurance performance, it means how far you, when you ingested caffeine, you can run. For example, when you are exhausted.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for clarifying that. And I think that kind of sets things up nicely for kind of why you wanted to do the study and what you're kind of looking to find out. So, now diving into kind of the methods for this study, what did you guys kind of do to test whether caffeine still has those kind of performance benefits if someone is kind of more or less trained?
Okay, but before that, let's get an overview of caffeine. Uh, uh, Caffeine is one of the most widely used substances on the planet. Estimates are that more than 90% of adults use caffeine on a daily basis. And regarding sport area, caffeine, I think, is one of the oldest supplements that are investigated in sport performance. I think nearly 100 years ago, Graham and colleagues, who were the first, published the effectiveness of caffeine ergogenic benefits or performance improvement on endurance performance. And since that time, there are numerous studies investigating caffeine's ergogenic effects on various types of exercise performance, including resistance training performance. Actually, there has been reported that caffeine ranging from 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram body weight could improve 1 RM muscle strength, muscular endurance, anaerobic power. And my research, actually, the method we use is a randomized control trial in which we recruited 20 athletes, which 10 of them were highly trained athletes and 10 of them were untrained. And in a randomized control trial, we gave them 6 milligrams per body weight caffeine. And 1 hour after ingesting caffeine, we measured the upper and lower body muscle strength and endurance, and the time period for peaking plasma caffeine is 1 hour. And so, because of that, we uh, give them rest for 1 hour, and after that, we starting our experimental trials. For our trained athletes, we use 10 highly trained athletes who have a who had resistant experience for minimally 5 years and also can live one repetition maximum of at least equal to their body weight in the bench press and squat as a entering criteria for our study. However, they were professional athletes, and some of them lifted nearly 2 times greater than their body weight. For our untrained athletes, we use athletes who just for fun lifting weight. So they nearly 2 or 3 times a week uh, uh, train, train, training, and our method was that we use bench press, muscular endurance, and 1 RM for upper body muscle body. We use squat, counter movement jump as for power indicator. And after 1 hour ingesting caffeine, they started to lift 1 repetition maximum for muscle strength, and with 70% of their 1 RM, they started to do a repetition to failure for measuring the muscular endurance. And as well as for lower body, we use the same method to measuring their muscle strength and muscle endurance.
Gotcha. So, to me, to kind of summarize that, it sounds like you had well trained athletes that had more than about 5 years of lifting experience, and then kind of more untrained athletes. And then with that, you gave them 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilo of body weight. Is that correct?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then since caffeine kind of peaks in the blood about 60 minutes after consumption, you had them do their training protocol about 60 minutes after consuming that caffeine. And you kind of did these strength tests as well as a counter movement jump test to test their overall strength, their strength endurance, as well as their kind of power from that counter movement jump. Does that sound like a decent summary there?
It's completely correct. We use counter movement jump as a power indicator. After we measure all the strength and muscular endurance, and use the height of the jump as a power indicator, and to see whether caffeine could improve their power when they are exhausted or no.
Perfect. Well, I think that that sets things up really nicely. I also like that you gave a kind of nice background on caffeine before we even got into your method. So that was awesome. But kind of transitioning into the results of the study here. So, with doing that, what did you guys find?
The results were mixed rayon. Actually, we saw mixed results of placebo effects of caffeine and the performance improvement of caffeine in upper and lower limb body mass and also in muscular endurance, but independent of the training status.
Mm.
And indeed, we see a little bit further improvement in our trained group unexpectedly. Actually, we saw greater improvement in our trained athletes. We gave you the average number of improvement. We see nearly 3.5 kilogram improvement in 1 RM bench press compared to the placebo, and we see 4.5 kilogram improvement compared to the control group. The control group are when they we don't them any supplements, and actually they did exercise with it's nothing for measuring the placebo effect of caffeine. And also regarding the muscular endurance, we saw the further 5 more repetitions in muscular endurance performance compared to placebo and control group. And regarding lower body muscles, we saw nearly 2.5 kilogram improvement compared to the placebo and control group, and 4 or 5 more reps in repetition to failure in squat exercise. It was for our trained athletes, and regarding our recreation athletes, we saw improvement, but a little bit lower than our trained participants, nearly 2 and 3 kilogram improvement in 1 RM bench press compared to placebo and control, and 4 more repetitions in muscular endurance. And in lower muscles, we saw the placebo effects of caffeine, which both caffeine and placebo improved 3 kilogram in 1 RM muscle strength compared to the control and control group. So regarding placebo effects, our result at the growing body of evidence, which indicates that certain proportion of the performance improvement of caffeine is attributed to the placebo effect. Nearly 50, the recent meta-analysis and showed that nearly 15% of the performance improvement of caffeine is attributed to the placebo.
Gotcha. So, it to me, it sounds like you did see some benefits of consuming caffeine, or your participants did, but it seemed like those benefits were independent of their training status. So whether they were kind of more trained or less trained, it didn't really seem to matter a whole lot. And you might have even saw just slightly better improvements for the actual more trained individuals.
Yes, exactly. As I mentioned in the mechanism of the caffeine, as you know, caffeine could pass the blood-brain barrier and directly affect your central nervous system by blocking the adenosine receptors, which offset sleepiness and increase alertness, and also delay the perception of fatigue. So, some scientists said that trained athletes have more adenosine receptors, and so the further improvement we saw in our trained athletes could be attributed to this theory that trained athletes have more adenosine receptors than untrained athletes.
Interesting. So that's one potential mechanism of action for why these trained athletes might have actually saw just slightly better performance improvements there.
Yes.
Were these results different than what you kind of expected going into things?
First, I just expected the improvement of muscular endurance regarding the delay the perception of fatigue of caffeine, and only in our untrained group, because our trained athletes were most of them were natural bodybuilder, and I thought that they were at the peak level of performance. And due to the low level of neuromuscular coordination of our untrained group. I didn't expect that caffeine could improve the muscle strength, but when we analyzed the outcomes, we saw the completely different
Yeah. And
results.
And that's one of the cool things about science is like, hey, you have some ideas going into it of what you think you would find, but sometimes it ends up being like the complete opposite thing of what you expected.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, I think that gives a really good overview of what you guys did, what results you found. But now, if we could just kind of turn to like some practical takeaways of this study or some practical applications for someone listening to this, what do you think maybe a few of those takeaways would be?
The takeaway message here, Ryan, is even you are a beginner starting resistance training, you can expect to improve your muscular strength and endurance performance by ingesting caffeine. And if you are a trained athlete, don't worry about your fitness level. You caffeine can still induce improvement in your records. As you know, some professional like me, I am a coffee addict and I hardly can go to gym even if I
mhm.
don't ingest my caffeine.
Yeah, you and me both.
You can still expect to improve your records by ingesting caffeine. However, it should be noted that we uh, gave our participant upper limit dose of caffeine, which 6 milligrams per kilogram body weight, which means it's nearly 5 or 6 cup of coffee you ingested, depending on the brand.
Mhm.
And but there need there are need to more evidence to whether low level dose of caffeine could improve resistance exercise performance independent of training status.
Perfect. Well, I think those are great takeaways for me. Like as you mentioned, one of the biggest takeaways is that even if I'm more trained, I could still drink all the caffeine I want and still receive some performance benefits of that for my training and stuff.
Yes, that's exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your what you did in your study and what you guys did, the results, and all that stuff. I think my audience will really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me, Ryan. And sorry if my language is a little bit weak because my English is not my main language. And sorry if I couldn't speak clearly.
No, I think you did an awesome job, and I think you did fantastic.
Thank you very much.